Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here and for joining us at the Chazen for this wonderful panel that we're about to experience. I do want to remind everyone that the galleries are open until 7 tonight, so after the panel discussion, you're welcome to go see the exhibition Wharton Esherick's work. And I am going to introduce our lovely speakers and our moderator, and then I will turn it over to them. First, we have Emily Zilber. Emily is the Director of Curatorial Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at the Wharton Esherick Museum in Malvern, Pennsylvania, where she curated the traveling exhibition, The Crafted World of Wharton Esherick. And edited its accompanying publication, which is also wonderful and for sale in the cafe if you're interested. Zilber also maintains an independent artist consulting practice, teaches curatorial studies and design history at Tyler School of Art and Architecture, and serves as a guest curator for institutions including the Renwick Gallery and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Before arriving at the Esherick, Zilber spent almost a decade as curator of contemporary decorative arts at the MFA Boston. Next, we have Tom Lozier. Tom is a Madison, Wisconsin-based artist and furniture maker. He was head of the UW Furniture Program from 1991 to 2020. He currently maintains his own independent workshop on Madison's beautiful East Side and develops new work for exhibition with a particular interest in seating. When he was attending Haverford College outside Philadelphia from 1975 to 1979, he visited the Esherick studio in person, probably in 1978. It was a highly influential and impactful experience that played a role in his growing interest in furniture making. Then we have Katie Hudnall, a woodworker, artist, and educator living in Madison, Wisconsin, where she runs the woodworking and furniture program at University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has a BFA in sculpture from the Corcoran College of Art and an MFA in woodworking and furniture design from Virginia Commonwealth University. Hudnall is curious about the aliveness of things and about how to make furniture as strange and dynamic as drawings. She was also a prize winner at the Wharton Esherick Museum's 28th annual Juried Woodworking Exhibition. Lastly, we have our moderator, Jody Throckmorton, who is chief curator at the John Michael Kohler Art Center. Before joining the Kohler Art Center in 2022, she was curator of contemporary art at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where she organized Joan Semmel, Skin in the Game, and co-curated Rena Banerjee, Make Me a Summary of the World. While at the San Jose Museum of Art, Throckmorton curated Post-Date, Photography and Inherited History in India. At the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, she worked to build their collection with transformative works by artists such as Maquita Ahuja, Joan Brown, Chitra Ganesh, Ebony Patterson, Marie Watt, and Diani Whitehawk, among others. So now I'll turn it over to Jody.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It is my pleasure to have you all with us for this, to celebrate with a panel this really extraordinary exhibition, The Crafted World of Wharton Esherick. And today's conversation will engage the theme of artist-built environment, so I wanted to just take 2 seconds and talk about what that means. And so those are spaces that have been significantly transformed by an artist to express aspects of their history, place, and culture. These environments defy disciplinary conventions. They challenge our expectations of function, authorship, and utility. And I would say that Esherick's life and work, and if you've seen the exhibition, and better yet, if you visited the house, is a really remarkable case study in what it means for an artist to be able to shape not only their personal world, but the world around us. So today we'll have a guided conversation, but also time at the end for you all to ask questions. So please do keep those questions in mind. So to begin, we asked the panelists to ground our discussion in one object or one group of objects that really sticks with them from Esherick's work. So we will start with Emily, I believe, right?
Yes.
Yes, great.
Yes. And I thought I would start with an object that's not really an object, although it is, right? Because the buildings at the Wharton Esherick Museum campus are all objects in our collection. So here we've got object as architecture. Actually, before I get going, how many folks in the audience have actually been to the studio? I'm curious. Okay, so we're really in the minority here. But that's, so we're gonna build the studio for you. I wanted to call attention to the dining room, and specifically the floor. This is one of my favorite spaces in the Esherick studio, for a couple of different reasons, and I think it gets at so much of what's exciting and innovative about Esherick as a thinker that you see in the exhibition. We've got this floor here that Esherick made from scraps that were given to him by Ed Ray, the logger who helped supply him with wood. Ray gave him the scraps for firewood, thinking he couldn't do anything with them, and instead Esherick made this remarkable mosaic that, apocryphally, Ray took that and said, I'm never giving you anything for free again. So this real ingenuity, this knack for problem solving. What I also love about this space, so this is the dining room space, is that Esherick approaches this, he's got this beautifully crafted floor, and that's not where you would think the care would be given in a space that was sort of, intended to be a studio, a workshop, right? In these spaces, we think of the floor as the place for you to walk on. It's going to get scuffed, it's going to get dirty. And the ceiling is where we usually have beautiful trim and things like that. And instead, Esherick has given all of this care to the floor, which is also beautiful and feels soft underfoot. It has this remarkable connection with your body, even though it is not the sort of one that we expect to have in that kind of a space. And then as you go up the wall, you'll see that the sides, you can still see the machine marks on the panels of wood there. And then by the time you get to the ceiling of the dining room area, we've got kind of raw shiplaped boards. And so when I give tours of the space, what I like to sort of encourage people to think about is how when they're in this dining room, not only is Esherick subverting expectations of how we engage with space, but he's also putting us inside a process. We've got raw to finished all surrounding us, and that helps to put the objects that are in the space in context. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, this is Tom.
But we can go.
Oh, so that's me.
Oh.
But so wait, I'm going to go off track just for a minute because Jody gave a great definition of an artist-built environment, but she had floated that question to us by email beforehand, and I spent a little time thinking about how I would define it. So
Excellent.
I wrote down a couple things. I said materials probably do not come from the normal supply stream. A tendency for things to not be square 90-degree angles, fastidious attention to detail, which might include making parts that are more often bought off the shelf. Things to look at everywhere you look, expresses the personality of the builder artist, and finally, might make them neighbors nervous.
That's right.
I picked something very simple, which is one of the first things you see when you go into the exhibition, and I think they're almost a little bit like hors d'oeuvres, but they give you a little bit of what he's up to. I think they're sort of less than perfect, but even better than perfect. They're very much handmade feeling. They're slightly lumpy and irregular. And I think one of the things that's interesting about these pieces, I think there's a couple different. Is there more than one? You might be able to sort of click through.
I think this is.
Oh, is it just one?
Yeah.
For each,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So we're looking at 2 sets of salad servers. I believe it's 4 trays and 2 bowls. One of the things that's interesting is that the bowls are displayed with their open sides towards the wall. So it's really the bottoms of the bowls that are being showcased. But the other thing is everything there has a hole in it, that Esherick included a hole in it. So he was thinking, it's probably partly because he was thinking about function and it's good to hang stuff up. But I think he's also thinking about the aesthetics of the object and the fact that they could make this gorgeous installation in the exhibition. And then I think the other thing is they seem to me to be very much driven by function and aesthetics. It's sort of a good illustration of that conversation that he's having. And especially probably the object that really knocked me out is this lowest bowl on the right, which doesn't show up that well in the photograph. So look at it when you go in, because that is a really cool surface with 4 little nubby legs, which are integrally carved into the bottom of the bowl. And the piece of wood is pretty spectacular. I'm not even sure. I guess you would call that a curly kind of a figure. But he's clearly paying a lot of attention to the relationship between the form and the grain, the kind of stuff that Katie and I talk about in Woodworking 101. And so here's a real master at it. And I think it's also sort of it was really interesting for me to see the salad servers. I didn't know about those, but I believe both Katie and I use utensils as one of the very first exercises that we give in woodworking classes, and it's sort of interesting to see that it goes back this far.
So I picked this piece. This is a chair that's in the exhibition, so go check this out. And it is the hammer handle chair. And I picked it because there are a lot of Wharton Esherick pieces that I sort of feel very fondly about. But I wanted to pick one that was in the exhibition so that you would sort of maybe go and look at it and think about it. Because even before I knew the sort of whole story of this chair, I read the title and I knew that it was made out of hammer handles, and I loved the idea of somebody finding these sort of utilitarian forms and thinking thinking of them immediately sort of as a problem to solve or as a possibility of a way to solve a problem. And I use lots of found wood in my sort of in my world. And so that I felt like a connection. And then later when I learned that he sort of bought a barrel of these things at auction, and sort of thinking about what it would be like to go home and try to convince your family that it was a good idea that you bought hundreds of hammer handles. I sort of love the idea of the confidence of knowing that this was going to be a useful form, even if he didn't know how it was going to be useful when he first bought it. He may have known, but I like that this form kind of talks about a material intelligence, because Esherick wasn't trained as a furniture maker. He was trained as a painter, printmaker, right? Mm-hmm. And so he has this kind of natural curiosity about woodworking that I think when you're sort of trained in formal woodworking, sometimes you forget to have, because you've been taught you start with these sort of boards and you make them perfectly square and then you work with them. But I think Wharton was sort of always looking at wooden materials and thinking what could that be? What could that be? What can I do with this? And I think that this object is one of those where you can see his curiosity transformed into an object. So.
Thank you.
Can we go
please.
back to the dining room image?
Oh, absolutely.
And just so you can see, there's hammer handle chairs at the dining room table there, so you get an idea of
I can even point to it for you.
of them in situ and how different they seem when they are in conversation with all of these other things around them.
Yeah, they're beautiful drawings. Not just they're really beautiful lines in them.
And that's exactly it. We wanted to ground you all in these individual objects or parts of the house, because this is in fact the first time that objects have been taken so completely out of the house and put on exhibition.
It's the largest group of objects. Our collection is over 3,000 objects, most of which Esherick made himself. There are objects that were gifts from other artists. There are things that he acquired during his travels. But the vast majority of what we have and what you see there was made by Esherick, either for the house or has become a part of the house. And so individual objects traveled. Esherick showed quite a bit during his lifetime. He had a solo exhibition at the Museum for Contemporary Crafts, now the Museum for Arts and Design in New York in 1958. Nothing to this scale has left the house. And for many of these objects, the last time that they left the house was that exhibition in 1958. So even if things have traveled, it's a good couple of decades since they've been out and about so robustly. Yeah.
And as much as I mean, seeing things anew in the exhibition space was really incredible. But I do want to ask you, Emily, since you get to see the space every day. every day. Lucky
Yep.
you. To take us there, to take us to Paoli or Malvern or however we. Yeah, okay. I'm realizing Paoli may be a very specific Philadelphia term, but take us to the Esherick House, and then also to ask you both to give your first impressions or what you really remember from being within the space.
Well, so I think one of the exciting things about seeing these objects out of the house, and I'll come back to the house in a minute, is how much we do take them for granted, seeing them in that space every day, because they are part of a larger kind of symphony. They are part of this larger total work of art, a Gesamtkunstwerk that Esherick has put together over the span of about a 40-year period. So Esherick's studio and the Wharton Esherick Museum's campus includes a number of different buildings, but I want to, talk specifically about the studio. He started to build it as a fairly utilitarian workspace in 1926. That's the first section where he's looking a lot at vernacular architecture, at Pennsylvania banked barns. He's thinking a lot about ideas of organic architecture as they relate to Frank Lloyd Wright, to Rudolf Steiner, to these interesting architect philosophers of the day. There is a second component that gets added to the studio where you see this space after he spends some time traveling in Europe. He is heavily influenced by German Expressionism. We get some angles, we get some references to the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And then the last piece that he contributes to the studio is in 1966. So we've got 40 years. And that is a silo that, again, speaks to vernacular architecture, but it has a fresco built in. He's bringing his painting training into his language. And so it is this building that Esherick called an autobiography in 3 dimensions, a total work of art, set in these sort of lovely bucolic hills that, now are, close to a lot of sort of built up environment. But when Esherick settled out there, it was farmland. He was really apart from the city, making his own kind of life in the middle of this rural space. Katie and Tom have spent time out there. I think, Tom, you said 1978?
I'm not sure.
Okay,
Somewhere
so
around there.
well,
Yeah,
to give a sense of the timeline, Esherick passes in 1970, and by 1972, the space is open as a museum. He knew it was going to become a museum space before his passing, and so if it was 78, you would have been there very shortly after.
I think I was shown around by his son-in-law.
Yeah.
Would that be?
Yeah, so the son-in-law and the daughter were the
Yeah.
co-founders of the institution, and Esherick's partner in the second half of his life used to give tours and live in the space while it was open as a museum. So it really is this space that has his story built into the architecture and the fabric of it.
And I saw the space in 2016 for the first time when I was a resident artist at an artist residency for woodworking in Philadelphia. So I was on a tour with a bunch of other woodworkers being led by Mark Sperry, who's a great woodworker, wood turner, who lives in not too far actually, in Philadelphia or outside of Philadelphia. And then I saw it again in 2022 when I came and dropped off artwork. I got to see have a tour of it, and it's a space that I'm sure maybe you know it really well now, but I think I could go 100 more times and still see 600 new details because so much of it has been built. It's a really beautiful space, and I think I feel quite lucky to have seen it and been given a tour of it the first time with a bunch of woodworkers by a woodworker because there's just sort of like a remarkable when I started learning woodworking and making furniture and making art, I sort of realized that I had this agency that often we sort of feel like we don't have, like this ability to change this objects around me that care for me. And I just found that agency so remarkable and so wonderful, especially as somebody who's female bodied. Like that was sort of an amazing thing. And I love giving that to my students. And I think this was one of the first spaces I saw where somebody had taken that agency and built an entire like home for themselves. And it was, it just sort of lit up all of my imagination in this great way.
So for me, it's a little bit of a long story. It's a little bit tied up with how I ended up working in this territory as a furniture maker. And I grew up in Boston, and my first contact with this kind of work was at the MFA Boston, which runs a really amazing program called Please Be Seated, where they commission gallery seating made by artists. And that mostly, when I was younger in Boston, that was kind of what's now considered the first generation of furniture makers. I was just going to mention some of the names. That would have been Tay Frid, who was teaching at RISD, Jerry Osgood, who taught at BU, Bill Kaiser, who taught at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and the non-academically associated, also James Krenoff came from Scandinavia and ran a school in Northern California. And then there was a group of non-school associated folks, which would include Judy McKee, Wendell Castle, Art Carpenter, and Sam Malouf were both in California. Does the MFA have Esherick work? Mm-hmm. Is it in the Please Be Seated?
It's not in the Please Be Seated.
Yeah. Okay. So the thing that's cool about the Please Be Seated program is you could sit in it, and a lot of that work was extremely tactile. If you know the Sam Malouf chairs, it's hard to hold your hand still on them. And so that was my first exposure to this kind of approach to furniture making and woodworking. And then I went to college in Philadelphia, and I studied sociology and anthropology and left-wing politics, and didn't really do any art, but I had heard about the Esherick House and Museum, and I went out there, and it had a huge impact, as Katie really beautifully said, to see this whole environment, and a person who is obviously a super skilled artist and who did a whole range of different kind of work, but also did this kind of work. And the whole idea that crafted three-dimensional objects could be such an area of personal expression, I think it had a really big impact on me. And then eventually I went to the Boston University program and studied furniture, and had a long path after that. But my first visit to the house was really, really influential. And I don't think I would add too much to what Katie said. I'll leave it there for now. Well, you know what? I'll tell you one other thing quickly to just sort of contextualize the field in a larger way is this first generation of furniture makers that I'm talking about. This was mostly identified by Ned Cook, who was at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and he curated a show called New American Furniture Makers, and he focused on the first and what he called the second generation of furniture makers. And so the first generation are the people that I mentioned, and then I'm a representative of the second generation. And because Ned was the first smart person who's also a good writer who ever put any brain power towards understanding this field, he got to kind of make up the whole structure. So he invented this generational structure, and I don't think it necessarily works anymore when you get down to Katie. Katie would be a third generation person, and the students she's teaching might be the fourth generation. But that model isn't really used anymore. But I thought what might be useful is that I think that Wharton Esherick, and perhaps one other person stands out in California, J.B. Blunk on the West Coast. I think they are almost like the prequel to this whole field that exists now. Like they're sort of like the people that exist a little bit outside of Ned Cook's structure and a little bit above it, and have all been hugely influential and important.
Yeah, I think Esherick, we hear so many kind of stories from first and second generation folks like you, where Esherick really gave them the permission to think about furniture as art. That was not something that Esherick did within any cohort, right? This is somebody who, was trained as an artist and really thought of himself as an artist. He was not in community with other furniture makers. He was in community with a lot of artists of varying backgrounds, whether they were skilled craftspeople or avant-garde writers, folks who were pushing boundaries or were really devoted to depth in their craft. And Esherick surrounded himself with people from both tracks. For a lot of folks we know, Esherick never wanted to teach. He rarely wanted to speak publicly about his work. He
He
thought
rarely
wanted to speak publicly
rarely.
about his work. We have a whole kind of stack in our archives of him turning down invitations to lecture and to talk or to write essays or to, and so for a lot of folks, coming to the studio was the way to connect with this sort of elder figure in the field who could give you a potential path forward, or at least the beginnings of one for a lot of studio furniture makers.
And was he generous with those invitations? How did you get invited to Esherick's studio? And
I think you showed up.
okay, okay.
He was not somebody who like took on acolytes. He was social and had a large group of sort of friends and colleagues. But in terms of younger makers who sought him out, a lot of folks just came. And maybe he would talk to them, and maybe he wouldn't. Wendell Castle certainly is probably the most well-known of the folks who sought Esherick out and really had a huge impact on the practice. You also have a couple of incidents like the Asilomar Conference, the big kind of foundational conference for the American Craft Council, where Esherick was there as an elder statesman, kind of a respondent to the conversation about wood that many of these first and second generation furniture makers had. And then, you know, folks got access that way as well. But this was not a situation where he was inviting people to come and learn at his feet. You had to seek it out.
Was it his idea that his home would become a museum? Because that's a very generous thing.
It's a complicated, story, but you know, Esherick's daughter and son-in-law, Bob Bascom, the son-in-law, and Ruth. Bob was trained as an architect. Ruth had this whole connection to her father's life and work, and by the end of his life, they took over the property from Esherick so that he could stay in it. And so it was ongoing conversations. Yeah.
I mean, it occurs to me as we're talking about what it means to make a life as an artist. And we think about artist environment builders, Esherick certainly, that, and I mean this in the best way, that he was a failed painter in a way, right? I think he's actually a pretty extraordinary painter, but he didn't end up going on and being a career. He met the right people in Alabama and learned to work with wood. But that this is also, to me, an impulse, slightly utopian, slightly, this is how I make my life as an artist. Moving to this space, building the space around it. So is there something utopian or even anarchic in these artist-built environments and specifically what Esherick was doing?
Well, I think that, you know, the other thing that was out there at that time was the book I remember is the one that was called Handmade Houses. And I should have looked up what year that came out. But I think you can't look at the Esherick stuff without, I don't think he was necessarily coming from the same place. He was trying to make a great art studio that was personally expressive, but it's certainly connected to sort of handmade houses and that whole drive. I don't know.
I mean, when Esherick leaves Philadelphia and sort of embarks on this rural exploration, which is, you know, rural but not so rural. It's they've just built a train line so you can get back into Philadelphia for events and openings and things in half an hour. He is going out there with the intention to essentially set up a small homestead, to farm the land, to teach their children on the property, to engage with nature. They go out there and they settle in an existing farmhouse that's there, but they want to live an organic lifestyle. And this is 1913, so organic before organic, right? And so by the time Esherick is creating this space in 1926, he's had a chance to learn the site, to learn the land, to work with it. He is painting, yes. He's not a hugely successful painter, but he's being supported by the land. His wife, Letty, is doing things like growing peonies that she's selling, and that's paying for their lifestyle. In amongst other sort of small scale efforts that she's taking on, and then also educating their children. So Esherick is thinking about building a life that's different from the one that he was born into a relatively well-to-do family. So was Letty. There were expectations from his family that they would have a similarly kind of upper middle class Philadelphia lifestyle, and they wanted to run away from that. They wanted to live organically, to be nudists. They were nudists at that point. And so really this is counterculture before counterculture, made possible by coming from a family with means, which is true for a lot of counterculture in the time that we think of as counterculture, right? So it's just all happening in the teens and the early 20s as opposed to the 60s and 70s.
And similarly to what you see gets saved. Because oftentimes if right, you don't have the family means and you don't have the mechanisms to save a house or whatever, these artist environments or these places get destroyed into the bins of history. Yeah.
The other thing I was just thinking, I mean, in many ways, he was a version of a multidisciplinary artist in a different time period. It's hard to sort of pull him into the present day, but it's interesting to think about what would he be like as an artist now? Would he engage with video and
Probably.
He's.
Yeah.
You say probably?
Oh, I think so. I mean, Esherick towards the end of his life was interviewed. There's a great interview in what's Craft Horizons then, but there's a sort of round table with a number of woodworkers, and he's asked about hand tools and whether you should only work with hand, and he says, it doesn't matter to me that what the tool is applesauce. It just needs to be the tool that's right for the job. And towards the end of his life, he was working with chainsaws to block things out. He built his own bandsaw using a bicycle wheel. We have that in the studio and workshop, right? This is a person who was more interested in creatively and materially solving problems than he was in doing something as it had been done. And some of that comes from being trained as a painter and never being formally trained as a woodworker. And some of it comes from coming to woodworking, in midlife. He's in his late 30s by the time that he is really engaging with this material. And he's had successes, but he's also had challenges. And some of it comes from wanting to do things himself, from wanting to, create the kind of buildings that weren't being built, from thinking about everything as generating from the same source. And a lot of that also comes back to his interest in Rudolf Steiner and the philosophy of anthroposophy, which if folks, I feel like most folks, if they know Steiner, they know like Waldorf education. But this notion that there are forms across the material world that all lead to the same kind of divine place. And so if that is true, making a chair and making a building and making a life and making a cutting board, those are all part of the same practice.
And as I think, because what's interesting to me is, and I think this is true for many artists, right? He had a commercial practice, he had a commission-based practice, and then he was creating this all-encompassing work of art. So how is it different? And maybe this is also a question for makers. How do you make something for yourself versus how do you make something for someone else? And then what if there was a difference in Esherick's approach to that as well?
I mean, I think that there's as many answers as there are artists and people out there making it. I have this sort of funny relationship to my art practice because I have been making art professionally since I graduated from grad school in 2005. But I have never tried to sell work ever. I've always sort of divorced it from my sort of primary income. So I worked in a cabinet shop using the skills that I had developed in school. But then I made work to show and funded that practice with my day job. And then I got a teaching position. And so I've continued to be able to like kind of divorce what I do in my studio from like direct income. And so my practice has always sort of been a place where I could go and kind of play and kind of see what happens. Of course, I have to exhibit the work in order to keep the teaching job, but I can sort of divorce those things. And what that has meant is that, you know, like if I suddenly am like, oh my gosh, I really, 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 really need a cutting board, I can just go to my shop and make a cutting board. and no one gets me in trouble, which is really lovely. And so like I sort of sprinkle in things for myself all over the place. And I am a homeowner now, very, very luckily, luck and privilege, right? But, you know, so now it's weird things like the handrail that was in the house when I bought it is wood, and the end of one of them now has an eyeball carved on it because I had time and I was bored one night. So there's, you know, like that is just sort of starting to happen in my space, and it's a very slippery slope. I'm a little afraid. But yeah, I do think that there's something really interesting about that, because there are a lot of people who want their work to make money for them. They feel like it should be like a tool that they use to have income. And I've always felt much more like mine was like a beloved pet, maybe something that I love and that I care about, and I want very much to put a house around it and protect it. That's sort of been my relationship to my making.
Yeah, I think that making for yourself and doing commissions is almost like opposite. Like there's like commissions, I'll tell you from the inside my head, when I do a commission, I feel like there's like two people sitting on my shoulders watching everything I do. I'm terrible at it. And so it took me a long time to figure it out, but I really turned down commissions. But then I think working for yourself and making something for yourself is just like, it's like a special, it's magic, it's wonderful. I mean, there's lots of things between those two.
Right. Right. Gift giving is a wonderful, like, I think that's a really lovely space. Like when I was a kid, if you asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, my answer was, for about a 10-year span, Santa Claus. I had sort of a version of Santa Claus where he was in a hut in a snowy, beautiful place, you know, just carving things. That's where I wanted to be, basically. That was my dream. And then I found out actually that was Wharton Esherick. It was not Santa Claus. Yeah.
I think it's interesting too, right? Because the commissions depend on who your collaborator is, right? So Esherick had commissions from folks who really said, go and do the thing that you want to do.
Yeah.
And he had some from folks who said, here are the constraints. You know, Esherick knew he needed to fund his life. He had resources to draw on, but was never wildly successful in his own financial stability. So, you know, he cultivated relationships with folks who would give him commissions where they either trusted him. He would say, I have an idea for you and I'm going to make the thing, and we'll develop a relationship over time so that you know I'm going to make you something incredible. It's probably going to cost about 4 times what I quote to you. We have a lot of invoices to that effect. He did commission. Some of his most significant commissions are for friends who are also other artists. I'm thinking of the bedroom suite he did for Marjorie Content, the modernist photographer, and we've got wonderful back and forth. So that's a collaborator in there. Esherick is also, you know, we have this space that I think it's very easy to think, okay, so he plans out everything for this purpose-built total work of art that he's living in, and it's something that grows and shifts and changes over 40 years. It starts out as a workshop space, a practical workshop. It's a home and more of a showroom by the end of his life. And during that time, he has pieces that were commissions that get incorporated into the site. The Bach House, which is one of the most significant commissions that Esherick does for Pennsylvania State Supreme Court Justice. The fireplace from that is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art's collection on permanent display, so you can go there and see that. If you come to visit our studio, we have a couch that was made for that commission in Esherick's bedroom that was returned. The patron was not interested. It's got this beautiful, rich upholstery. It sort of seems strange in this space that is very much an artist space. It was very deep, and so she complained that her society friends couldn't sit on it and keep their decorum. But it makes this remarkably beautiful place for lounging in his own bedroom. And he thinks about, how do I incorporate this into this ever-changing, ever-living, breathing kind of space that I'm making for myself? And so I think Tom's exactly right. There's a spectrum of, am I making for myself? Am I making for someone else? How do I adapt a piece that I've made for someone else, for myself? How do I use the opportunity to make for myself, to make something that I might share with someone else? And one of the great things about an artist space is that you kind of see all of those things collapsed on, it's a timeline, but we see them all in one space at the same time.
And one thing is in the exhibition, at the end there's 2 videos, and one is that's just amazing is them moving the spiral staircase, which is really the heart and soul of this place, moving that spiral staircase to the, what was it called at that point, the American...
Well, so it was it left the studio twice.
Oh, twice.
And so
okay.
it's the spiral staircase, which is at, the crux of the studio. When people think about the studio, they think it's not in this image. That's a different staircase. But there's a great image of it blown up because there's models and sort of wonderful things in the gallery.
No.
Oh yeah, no,
Yes.
we got it.
There we go.
So there's 3 things. It's interesting to remember that when the workshop space was originally built, there was no staircase because there was no second floor. So this is not an original part of the construction of the space, even though it is so iconically associated with it. It leaves 2 times. One, to be a part of the America at Home exhibition at the World's Fair in 1940 in Queens, New York. And then it leaves in 1958 to be a part of Esherick's retrospective. He also had it for sale. You could buy this and take it home with you for $900 at the time of the World's Fair. So somebody made a real mistake then. But so that ability to think malleably,
Yes.
and to think, we think of Esherick as somebody who approaches things with care but not preciousness.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not going to be precious about this being, this part of this space. I'm going to give it care. I'm going to integrate it in this kind of beautiful way so that it seems like it's a seamless part of it. But I also know that things change, things ebb and things flow. I might want things to be different. My practice might change, my needs might change, and my space can change accordingly.
I think that's one of the really beautiful things about his studio space is like there's a recognition, even if it's not conscious when you walk in there, that this is a space that grew, that this is a place that that has to have had years and years of life in it to become the thing that you couldn't draw that. It isn't crisp enough to have drawn it or something. It's like it is beautifully like lived in over time. You can sort of imagine him sort of wandering around and being like, oh, this could do, oh, I could do that. Oh, and like, yeah.
There's a MoMA exhibition that has called from the 50s, I believe, called Architecture Without Architects. Which Esherick has the catalog for in his bedroom, and I really think that's a great way of thinking about it. He's building a space, but he's thinking about a time before you have an architect who comes in and makes those straight lines and makes those plans. Right. It's what do I need? Right. And the idea of architecture through most of human history is people not going to architecture school, but it's people saying, what do I need? And then figuring out how to build the thing around them.
But do I understand correctly that the left wing off the spiral staircase, that was a later addition? It was initially just a regular spiral staircase?
There was no spiral staircase at the beginning.
But then he put in the spiral.
When you put on the addition, he put on the addition in the 1940s, he had to branch out and create something. Yep. Yeah. So this is all responsive to need, which is, what material culture has been for most of human history. It's people figuring out what their needs were and figuring out how they can meet them materially.
Right. And I do just want to switch gears because we're getting to the end of our hours just a bit, because I do want to ask about your students and how they respond to Esherick's work, how they've responded to the exhibition. What from Esherick's spirit do you take into your own teaching?
So I've teach two woodworking classes here, beginning and advanced, which is anyone who has taken the beginning class can take the advanced class as many times as they want. So that's a bit of a stacked class with students that have had 3 months worth of woodworking, or they've been in it for 3 years potentially. And I brought both groups of students here, and that's been just an absolute amazing resource to have, to be able to sort of like come across the street and see somebody who was really the father of the studio furniture movement, which is the movement that brought woodworking as an art form into so many universities, including UW. And what, I mean, I think that they have been sort of amazed to see, because it's happening for them, but it's happening, like when you're in school, you're sort of so deep in it, I think it's a little bit hard to see. But to see somebody who marries printmaking, woodblock prints, furniture, sculpted wooden pieces, games, I mean, there's so many things in that space that he's doing, and every part of it he's using kind of the same abilities or the same skills and the same sort of visual language to tie it all together. And I think for them to be like, oh, all of these pieces feel like they fit together, was really wonderful. Like that was a really lovely thing. And it sort of reminded me that especially with some of my seniors, to get them to bring in, like, what are you doing in your painting class? What are you doing in your printmaking class? So that they can say, oh, I'm doing this. It's very different. And then we all look at it and say, there's you in there. You're in all of these pieces, and it's a really clear, beautiful self-portrait. So I think that that was something that was really, really lovely for them. And I think that sort of understanding that the woodworking can leave a wood shop, can leave a place where you go and already have materials, and that it can leave that place and go into your home where wooden materials already exist, and you can basically affect change in any sort of objects that you live with, like you can cut down the handle of your wooden spoon. You can cut down the legs of your chairs if they're too tall. I'm thinking about this because I'm a short person. You can have this sort of like effect on your spaces that you wouldn't necessarily think that you would have. I think that those are kind of like some of the main things that they carried back with them, is that like this sort of broader understanding of how the woodworking leaves our shop and goes back into their lives, was really, really wonderful.
Well, and we were talking before the panel about the touch section, which your class took, which is just so beautiful.
Yeah. So the touch section was actually commissioned by the Chazen through one of my grad students, Sam Northcutt, who's graduating this year, and he did an absolutely beautiful job with it. But he took the 4 sort of most used woods in the exhibition, and sort of made all the same blocks, and then he took a Sharpie and kind of like he had been through the Esherick show. They let him come through a little bit early and see some things, and so he sort of like imagined Esherick shapes, and drew them out on Sharpie, and he carved 2 of them, and then immediately he fell on the ice this winter and broke his hand. And so I got to help finish one of the blocks just based on Sam's sort of drawings on it, and the rest of the students each took a block to help Sam finish. And it was a really beautiful sort of moment, and it's been so lovely to have so many people. Like every time I go in that gallery, there's somebody like almost holding one of those blocks like it's a baby, and I'm like, yeah, Sam did a really, really good job, and I'm so glad I got to be part of that. Yeah, it's wonderful.
I was going to say what I think one of the things that is visible when you walk through the exhibition is that Esherick is a self-taught woodworker. Yeah. Like you can find moments where he's figuring out how to solve certain situations, and I wish I had the picture of it, but it's the big cabinet that's against the wall that's closest to University Avenue that has the relief carving. What's that one called?
That's the drop leaf desk, and that's the first piece of furniture that he makes.
Yeah. So when you look at that piece, look at how he figured out the hinging. It's crazy, and it's not easy. And it almost looks medieval, like it could be in the Victoria and Albert Museum. But he just figured out how to do it, and he made it work. And there's many moments like that in the exhibition, and I think that's an interesting model for students. You don't have to necessarily study with Katie. you could maybe figure this out on your own in your in your basement.
Yeah.
Trial and error.
Trial and
Yeah.
error.
A while.
Yep.
I was going to say that's one of the things that I think so interesting is like that Esherick inspired the first and second generation of makers, and that they then had this sort of formal education in woodworking is fantastic. But my background is in illustration and sculpture, and then I went to grad school for woodworking, but I still didn't really know anything. I didn't know what the joinery was called until I was TAing a class for beginning woodworking, and I was like, oh, that's called a tenon, cool. And I feel like this sort of kinship with Esherick, and this sort of like tacit sort of approval of being a weirdo woodworker who wasn't necessarily brought up in woodworking, because his work is sometimes sort of goofily made in the most beautiful way possible, like very intelligent, but like not the sort of the ways that obviously he kind of figured some things out himself, and so there's an idiosyncrasy to a lot of it, which is great.
Yeah, he works as he's sort of beginning to move from carving print blocks to creating furniture pieces. He works in the workshop of a man named John Schmidt, who's a very classically trained European cabinet maker. And Schmidt, he takes some things from him, and some things he says, I'm going to figure this out on my own. And so this permission to be himself, even when it comes to problem solving through material, is, I think, something that is unique to Esherick, and hard to come by as you have the kind of standardization of a lot of kind of like academic programs. So I think it's certainly a place where we find people coming to the studio really being inspired, woodworkers who say, I didn't know I could do it like that.
Right.
And nobody needs to give them permission, they just need to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to ask you one question, Emily, about what it was like to work with the museums to translate this incredible space into an exhibition. Challenges, tensions, what was it like translating this into an exhibition, which I think does really beautifully convey the space, but also give the objects sort of their moment to shine?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see these pieces in situ, and they tell one story when they're in context. And they tell a really different story when they're out of context, when they're in these, and it's good for the pieces to be seen both ways. So this was a thrilling opportunity, right? Because just because something is in that kind of wonderful studio space doesn't mean it always needs to be there, and it doesn't mean that's the only kind of story it can tell. That said, it also means that Esherick, through the way that he situated objects in the space, gives us a lot to look at when we're thinking about how to design a world for the objects that he made. And so things like the bright splashes of color that you see throughout the installation here. Esherick trained as a colorist. If you come to the studio, you will see window casings that are this bright cobalt blue. You'll see him using these kind of moments of color. And we worked with the first venue, Brandywine, to draw colors from Esherick's own paint samples. And so we were thinking about his work towards the studio. What does it feel like to be in these spaces where you're not seeing everything in a clear kind of white-walled space, but things are overlapping? Things are up against each other, so that you are necessarily seeing conversations between objects and not just singular objects. You'll notice that there's cutouts in the walls, that there are multiple objects on platforms. And so we're thinking about how we can have objects relate to each other, even though we are not in a space that's quite as full and luscious as this. And so do I think that either experience replaces the other? No. I would hope that everyone who didn't raise their hand, which is most of you, has a chance to come out and visit our site. You know, the reality of conservation at a historic artist's home and studio that, you know, is not intended as a big public-facing space like the Chazen is that for reasons of preservation, we can have no more than 6,000 people a year come through our site. And so the opportunity to share not only these objects, but also the feeling as much as we can through the design and through the stories that we're telling with so many more people, it's really an exciting back and forth for us that really we had plenty of folks in our circles who said, "I cannot believe that you're taking things out of the studio," and our response to that is, well, it helps them live in the way that they're supposed to.
Can I add? So one thing is, when I went there in 1978 and was led around, there was very much the feeling that the family was still the kids were trying to figure out what to do with this thing. And so the tour was not like one of those polished sort of thing. I think they sort of opened the door and we went in and we looked around and then they answered questions. It was more sort of on that kind of basis. So it's been really amazing to see this become a full-fledged, professionally run museum with smart people working there. And they also do this annual juried exhibition. And you also host a artist in residency.
We do. I'm working with
and so I think that one of the reasons I'm saying that is I don't think we would know as much about Wharton Esherick, and he certainly wouldn't be chasing us down in Madison, Wisconsin with this incredible exhibition if it wasn't that the museum is sort of a thriving place. And I mean, I was amazed when I found out that this exhibition was coming here. But so it's sort of interesting just in sort of big picture to see how it's evolved from what I saw in the late 70s to what it is now.
Can I make a plug for going to the
Please.
museum?
By all
I'm going to
means.
make a plug for going to the museum. If you've seen this work and you think it's absolutely beautiful, I would say like one of the sort of remarkable things about getting to go to the Esherick Museum, his studio, and be in that for any amount of time. You can't touch anything there, of course, but you get to see some of the systems that he lived with. You get to see the way that he figured out how to like take a light that he wanted to turn on in one place and run a cord way over to another spot and turn it on. You get to have a sense of the way that he engineered the space. You get a sense of how tall he was, you know what I mean? You get a sense of how big he was in his space. There's something like really beautiful about the way that he solved problems, not just with objects, but with the way that those objects are arranged and the systems and the architecture in the museum. And it's so much fun to go in there and just be a detective and try and think about him living 1 hour in that space. Like, that's my assignment to you all, is you now have to go to Pennsylvania and do this. You got to be one of the 6,000 in this next year.
But I would also say that's also what you can do in any space, right? Yeah. We're part of a historic artist homes and studios network. You can go to any of those sites and do the same thing. You can go to your friend's house and look at it with a different eye, right? How is this person arranging how are they living, and how do the objects that are in their space say something, right? Yeah. So I think, yes, we want all of you to come. I'm not, but I also think there are these lessons of engaging with a space that you can then take to the way that you look at material in the world, whether you're in a sort of formal gallery space or not.
Yeah. No,
What did you call it? 1 hour in a space? You said something really great. 1 hour in a space. I should have written it down as you said it. I feel like that's the homework too. You go home tonight. Yeah. 1 hour doing nothing but considering your space as an artist environment.
This is a thing I do anyway. I almost can't help it. But as you walk around campus, like, look for the shiny doorknobs, right? Mm. Like, you're going to figure out where students go the most if you just look for the shiny doorknobs. Mm-hmm. It's hilarious and so true. I'll be like, that's the door everyone goes into. Or like every once in a while, I'll be outside of a building that have a meeting in. I've never been there before. I'm like, this is not the doorway. There are no shiny doorknobs. So I think, like, yeah, become detectives and sort of look at how people move through their worlds, because it's fun. It's really interesting.
Well, thank you all. It is time. If anyone has any questions, happy to please just raise your hand and ask, and I'll repeat. Yes, sir.
Something I'm
Yes.
thinking about. It's a great exhibition. There's very little about the collaboration of Esherick and Louis Kahn. Mm-hmm. And I'm really fascinated. And like Tom, I visited out there. And I think when I was first out there, that building was still full of tools, and I think his workers were still working in that building. So it was in the early 1970s, but that struck me from my first visit was the campus is actually a compendium of buildings. Mm-hmm. You could even take into account the old farmhouse, I suppose. But I'm particularly interested in, you know, Louis Kahn, international modernist, relationship with Wharton Esherick. I'm very fascinated by that. And then I'm also wondering about the visitor center, the garage. Did he build that?
Did
And
everyone
they're,
hear?
They're put together in an interesting way. The Louis Kahn building, and it's almost rustic Americana. And for me, the whole environment is that compendium of all of the buildings. But I really like the panel's thoughts on, if you have any thoughts on the collaboration with Louis Kahn.
Did everyone hear that? Or oh, great, good. I won't repeat
You
then.
don't have to try to
I love it. Go, please.
Well, I think what's really interesting about that question, right? The reason that the Kahn building and that space is not in what you see here is that the Kahn building has not had 50 years of being open to the public as museum space, whereas the studio and workshop has. So I would encourage everyone to go take a look at the catalog. There's beautiful photography of the Kahn building that can give you a sense of what we're talking about here. But Esherick outgrows the studio here as a workspace. He's making big commissions. He needs more space to work. And in 1956, this structure is built on the campus. That's a collaboration between Esherick, Louis Kahn, and Ann Ting in Kahn's office. And Ting had quite a bit to do with the design of the space itself. And her name often gets left off of the list, and her name is not on the exterior of the building, whereas the other two have their initials there. So I try to make sure I bring Ting into it whenever I can. And so that space, for many, many years, Bob and Ruth, who were Esherick's daughter and son-in-law, who ran the museum from its early days, in order to make Esherick's home and studio a public-facing space, moved into that 1956 workshop. They made it their home for 5 decades. And so the museum, it's been part of the collection for a long time. We've only had access to it as a part of our public-facing space for just the last couple of years. And so it is this interesting building because it's not in most Kahn surveys. It's not something that we think of as being strongly associated. You know, when we think of Esherick's building, we think of the studio. We don't, except for folks who have been to the site. And so now, 50 years into the life of this institution, we get to do more. We get to do more research. We get to talk about how working with Esherick really brought notions of organic into international modernism. We know that the Kahn structure is shaped in these honeycomb-like patterns because Ann Ting is thinking about how can I think about nature and the organic world through geometry, through this language that I'm working with. And so, you know, that's one of the things that's so exciting about a site like this is that as things unfold, as we're able to bring them into what we can share with the public, we get to really find new perspectives on spaces that we've taken for granted, but which, you know, in this case was a private space for many, many years. So if you come out, I'll encourage you to come out. We now have an architecture-focused tour of the campus that brings the Kahn building into it quite a bit. And we are also working with the Margaret Esherick House, which is a Kahn-designed private home for Wharton Esherick's niece, in which Esherick did the kitchen. That's in the Chestnut Hill neighborhood of Philadelphia, and we facilitate access to that space. And so we are really thinking about the architectural legacy in different ways.
Were Kahn and Esherick familiar with each other? They both grew up in Philadelphia.
Yeah, Kahn and Esherick were connected through George Howe, who Howe was the architect that Esherick collaborated on the World's Fair Pavilion with. And so by the time Esherick needed to build this additional studio space, in 1926 he didn't need any permits to create something. And by 1956 he needed an architect of record. And this is Kahn, you know, came onto the project. They collaborated, but they hadn't worked together before, but they both respected each other. Kahn held his firm's parties, his firm's holiday parties in Esherick's workshop, and so this was a space that was special to him and his team. There's lots of really good information out there about that relationship.
Thank you. Yes.
so for the past few weeks, I've been traveling, meeting with woodworkers in Japan and California, and so Blanc, Nakashima, and all these other rock stars, like you see this like all this like connection to like Japan, and then like the whole arts and crafts movement, like huge connection to Japan. Obviously, like I don't think he was like traveling to Japan, but like he had all this like influence that it and Khan, right? Like Japan, like it seems like Japan like needs some kind of shout out with like some of these forms and creations that kind of like created this American.
Where do you see
and it's like all just like popping, like all of a sudden it was like, whoa, this is all. I didn't like realize like how influential.
What did you see in the exhibition that made you think connections to Japan? Because it doesn't pop immediately to my mind.
I mean, just looking at this, like that just looks like literally something that like you've got
the sort of heavy timber.
Organic,
Yeah.
shapes, like you have you know, asymmetry using whole
Large timber
yeah,
construction.
and it's something
Yeah.
that deeply resonates with what I was seeing
Mm-hmm.
there. And so it just, I don't know, I thought that's like kind of interesting how that's how that was probably influencing him through in ways he probably didn't even realize.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and I think for Esherick, it's also, you know, where we think of asymmetry as something that tends to be associated with Japanese design. It's also a big part of anthroposophist design and Rudolf Steiner, right? And so there are these connections, there are these visual cues that come up in different modes of design and making that allow these things to speak to each other in ways, even if Esherick, that's not, you know, Japanese design is not something that he's consciously thinking about, but he's
It
thinking
wasn't,
about
like,
Steiner
consciously,
and he's
but-
thinking about
Yeah, all that in the 1850s, it was just
Yep.
blowing like Japanese.
He's thinking about arts and crafts. He's spending time in Rose Valley, which is an arts and crafts colony in Pennsylvania. So all of these things are speaking to each other. I will tell a funny story with the staircase that we have in our collection, a letter that somebody wrote to George Nakashima saying, I saw the staircase from your home in a magazine, and I'm hoping you can send me plans so that I can reproduce it in my own home. And he writes back to her, Nakashima writes, I'm sorry, I think you mean Wharton Esherick. You can try him. And so that letter gets forwarded when the letter comes to, so clearly people of the day are you know, making those connections as well.
Can you book public tours at the Nakashima place?
Yeah, and yeah.
So the Nakashima compound is not far away. You can make you can't absorb both places in one day, so you got to plan a longer trip. But
We can do a good woodworker's itinerary for
Yeah.
anyone who comes out to us.
There you go.
Yes.
Maybe a question for Tom and Katie as like artists yourselves. I'm curious about your thoughts on like the relationship between the artist as a person and then the community that they're within. Just thinking about Tom, you mentioned like seeing him, Esherick, like figure out a hinge on his own, which seems super cool. But at the same time, he's working with a world-renowned cabinet maker or friends with Lou Kahn, and they're having like all of Lou Kahn's associates there for a holiday party. Like part of me is like, yeah, I can make that hinge, and then the other part's like, but I don't know Lou Kahn. So I'm curious, like, just to be a successful artist in different levels of community, and yeah, can you do it on your own? Do you have to have that whole big group of famous people around you to be successful?
I mean, my sense, but partly from what Emily said, and I did some reading, you know, in relation to the exhibition, is that part of why he moved where he did was so he could be out in the country, but also stay connected to this pretty high-powered network of artists that he was connected to, that he liked to be interacting with. So he wasn't a hermit, and.
Even though that's the myth.
Yeah, I don't think so at all. And it seemed like his place was also a destination, like people would stop by. I think you said that people with names that we now recognize would stop by and visit him. So
But you're sort of asking about like
in
our practices
bigger
too.
picture.
Like do you feel like community is important?
Yes. I mean, Yeah, I don't. That's a great question. It's really complicated. I mean, I think different places have different sort of support networks for
Right.
the arts, right?
Yeah.
And Madison's sort of an interesting place. I've been here too long, so I don't know other places. You've got
I was gonna say,
something-
I have sort of feelings about this because I think it's an interesting thing. Like woodworking, if I think about some of the crafts, like I think we think of like textiles work as being done in community a lot. Glass blowing, you sort of need a partner, right? Like there's a sort of built-in community because you have needs. Like even ceramics, like when you fire a kiln, you're probably firing a kiln that's taking a lot of energy, and you're inviting all of your friends to fill a kiln. And woodworking, there's this sort of notion that you can be a hermit, and you probably want to be a hermit. There's a curmudgeon sort of like sense, like overlaid over woodworking, and I think that I have found in my sort of world that cheesy as it is, like faster alone, farther together, right? That the community has been such a huge thing for me to learn. Like there's so much to learn. Like woodworking is such a long process. You can spend your whole life learning, and you will never know it all. Trees are way smarter than we are. And so I think like having a community of people who are also working around you, and space by yourself, I think that's huge and important, at least for me in my practice. But like whether that is like the people in my community, like Tom, that I get to go and see Tom in his studio and be like, oh my God, you do it that way. That's so smart. Or social media. I have friends now that I sort of like know only through those platforms, which that's a troubling space sometimes, but also a wonderful one. Or like things like the Furniture Society organization, which is, like a wonderful organization nationally that hosts conferences, and that's where I've met a lot of my friends. And I have like couches I can crash on across the country now of brilliant woodworkers. But I think, like the notion that he had this space by himself, but that people were constantly coming to him was probably what made his work so good. Like he was learning from other people all the time.
I think it's, he's also somebody who, the people that he met introduced him to other people who introduced him to other people, none of whom were like Henry Varnum Poor or Lou Kahn at the time that he met them, right? With these like capital Lou Kahn letters, right? So the idea that anyone who is creative and wants to engage in conversations with you about creative practice or your work, whether they're another furniture maker, whether they're a writer, right? He's close friends with Sherwood Anderson and Theodore Dreiser. Have those conversations, right? Those people weren't necessarily who we think of them being at that time. They were just other artists. They were other creative people who sparked something in Esherick. And frankly, we don't talk about the fact that Bert Culp, right, who's a stonemason, is one of Esherick's, right, like John Schmidt, who's the cabinet maker, these people who were fundamental to his growth as an artist, but they don't have those big names, right? Those are no less important. It's just a question of how history gets written. And so, I think the takeaway is not you need to know a Lou Kahn. The takeaway is open yourself up to other creative people.
I have a kind of Madison art community furniture thing that is kind of interesting, and that so the person that I inherited the furniture program up over there was Skip Johnson, who ran the program for 30 years. And if Skip was sitting here, then there's me, and then there's Katie. That's the whole program, as long as it's existed. And I had this experience when I moved to Madison from the coasts, that for a long time, it hasn't happened in a few years now, but I'd say like 5 or 6 times over the years, I've been at an event and I've been talking to somebody and they ask me what I do, and I say what I do, and they'll say, oh yeah, I took woodworking from Skip Johnson. And it's this sort of submerged current in the community. I mean, maybe it's partly the sort of world that we live in, but I think there's the visible part of the art world, but then there's that sort of network also.
It's still happening. Like I now get Skip and Tom. Like my mechanic took woodworking with Skip Johnson, and half the people I meet in the community are like, Tom Loser. I'm like, yes, I'm the shorter version. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think it's interesting, Emily, when you were just talking about the people that we don't know that influenced him. That there's not any. I mean, this is where he worked. This is where he lived. This is where he slept there. He ate there. But also, I think it's really interesting that we're not learning anything about his family. I mean, and we're not seeing a bedroom, bathroom, or kitchen, or dishes, or toys, or shoes. You know, I mean, I think this is. I've never been here, and it's very altar-like. And this is my only exposure to it is through the show and your talk right now. And I just think it's sort of like, wait a second, if this is somebody's home, let's hear more about the people that engaged with this space. And because he wasn't an island. He responded to maybe somebody else that lived there with him, or maybe something else that he had exposure to, and we don't really get to hear, you know, except for the famous people, all of whom seem to be male people. There's nothing about domesticity in anything that you guys are talking about, and I feel like it's a huge void, and I wonder why the void is so present.
I think that's an incredible point. And there's a couple of different answers that I have for you. One is that if you do come to the space, you will see bathrooms, you will see bedrooms. Two is that this studio space, this living space, was not where Esherick's family life happened. And so Esherick, they moved out to, they had this farmhouse that they moved out to. Esherick built this space as a workshop. It gradually became a home, but it's never the space where his wife or his children, save for his son, Peter, who stayed there with him at some point in time, lived. It is not the locus of the family life. And so when you go into the exhibition, you can see Sunnycrest. There's sort of prints that talk about Sunnycrest and the division between that home where the children were, home where the domestic life was happening, and then workspace and also later living space that was not connected to that world. That sort of trip through the woods was not just a way to, get ready to be in a making kind of space, but also it was to transition from a world that he could leave behind, which was made possible because of his wife, to a different kind of world. And so there's some of that that's built into it, and there's also some of that because we tell the stories that we want to tell. And so for many years, the story of Wharton Esherick and the story of the site was Wharton Esherick, lone genius, on the hill, doing his thing, period. And that's not the story. And so one of the things that we are focused on doing curatorially at the museum is really thinking about how we can complicate that narrative. And so it's talking about the networks. It's, I'll mention now, I'm working with our current artist in residence, Kelly Cobb, who is doing research on 3 suitcases of textiles of Letty's that we just discovered about 2 or 3 years ago. When we were given access to the workshop space finally, that were never shared.
And Letty's his wife.
And Letty's his wife. And so I have an artist who is interested in doing that research finally, who is engaging with those materials, and we get to bring attention to these stories in ways that they haven't been. And so it's one of the reasons why institutions like this need to have long lives, because the stories that they're telling in the first part of their existence aren't the only stories, aren't the full stories. We don't know what gets held back. We don't know what gets shared. We don't know what gets shoved to the side so that you can make a narrative. And when an institution can have a long history, you get to actually bring that evidence to light. So I think it's a really important point that you're making. Both some of it is structural in terms of how Esherick designed the life, but also some of it is the result of biases that we get to counteract now. So thank you for asking that. I'll also, if folks, there's a really wonderful, we had a research intern who did a wonderful rundown of Letty, and the domesticity is something that you're particularly interested in, did a really wonderful rundown of the textiles that we found about 2 years ago, and that's on our website, and we can make sure that you have access to that.
Any additional questions? Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Emily. And really, congratulations to all of you and the Chazen on this really extraordinary exhibition. So thank you, thank you. And everyone, please go see the show. It's open.